Last couple of weeks, we have been chronicling the life of Jesus Christ. In his last week of his ministry here on earth before his crucifixion and resurrection. We've determined it's a pretty important week. His message, that's always significant and important throughout the Gospels, but here it seems to have a different weight to it because he knows that his ministry here on earth is quickly coming to a close. And make no mistake about it, Jesus knew exactly what was about to happen and when. He knew he was close. It's one of the reasons I love the conversation that he had with a few of his friends and his disciples on Tuesday. It's day 3 now. It's Tuesday, and he and his disciples had obviously begun that day in the temple, and that would not have been at all unusual for them to take a few minutes in the morning to go into the temple just to pray and to worship, to prepare for their day. And in chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, we pick up the story as they are finishing their time of prayer and they're coming out of the temple. And here's what he says. And as he came out of the temple, verse 1, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." One of the disciples directed their attention to the grandeur of the temple building and the temple facility. Obviously, it was an incredibly beautiful structure, a powerful structure, an ornate structure. People would come from miles around, make pilgrimages just to see the temple one time in their lifetime. And it was as though the disciple was saying, "Lord, look how blessed we are to be here today and to see this beautiful building." Verse 2, Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Wow. Now, a quick history lesson reminds us that this prophecy that Jesus was making had a very specific fulfillment in 70 AD. For there, Titus, the emperor of Rome, became frustrated at an uprising among the Jewish people that had started in the early 60s. And in his desire to put an end to that uprising, he turned his troops onto the capital city of Jerusalem and went in and destroyed much of the city, but took his wrath out on the temple itself and literally obliterated it. The Bible tells us that not one stone was left upon another as Jesus prophesied. And also, history tells us this. It says that because of all of the ornate decorations that were in the building, the gold tapestries and the gold inlays, when the building was burned, the gold melted and ran down between the cracks in the stones. And in order to excavate the gold, the soldiers literally tore every stone apart. Jesus said, "Don't get too attached to the building. I love verse 3. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately." I love that picture of Jesus. Let's use our imaginations for just a moment and realize here's what the Bible's telling us. Jesus had left the temple with his disciples and they had gone back out of the city onto the Mount of Olives, and they had found him a place to sit down where they could sit together and look out over the city and see very specifically the temple. But here's what I like about it. Jesus is only a couple of days from a period in his life that he knows is going to be the most horrific that anyone has ever gone through. He knows about his arrest. He knows that he is going to be beaten unmercifully. He knows that he is going to be nailed on a cross. And yet here we find he's not hustling around and bustling around trying to find an easy way out. We find him taking a break with his friends. Isn't that beautiful? He's just sitting there. He's literally a few days from what might be rightly determined as the biggest day in the history of the world. And Jesus said, come over, let's sit down and talk for a little while. And he brings that inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, two sets of brothers, and they join him for just some private conversation. And their question is a specific one. It says, Lord, can you tell us when that's going to happen? This thing about the temple, listen, it says, verse 4, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all of these things are about to be accomplished? Well, what things? Jesus just made a powerful statement about the most important, the most impressive building on the planet, the temple in Jerusalem. And he said, the day will come when not one stone will be left standing upon another. And they said, Lord, when's that going to happen? And I love what Jesus does next. He takes the opportunity to take this very specific question and use it to give a very broad but important answer. You know the times when you're in a conversation with someone and maybe the conversation starts small and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you find yourself in a pretty deep discussion about something, and it's like, oh, we're not talking about that anymore. When did this change to? And you realize that the conversation is going in a completely different direction. And this is what is happening with Jesus. He is deliberately taking the conversation to a different place. Yes, he tells them something about the destruction of the temple, and he gives them some ideas about when that is going to take place, but he then begins to talk about something that is much bigger than that, something much more important than that, which we're going to refer to this morning as his return. Do you believe that Jesus is coming again? Boy, I do. Oh, church, listen, we need to believe that again and again and again. We need to remember this morning that Jesus is coming again. We talk about it. It's in our songs. It's in our study courses and in our lessons, and occasionally we preach a sermon or two on it. But I think it's time, it's very much so time for the church today, the modern church today, to begin to live and work and minister once again as though we truly believe that Jesus is coming again. You see, Jesus had already told them that he was going to have to leave the world, and they were troubled by that. But here he is on just a few days before he was going to be put in a grave. And he said, I got something I want to say to you guys. I'm coming again. It's not over until I say it's over. What a great word of encouragement, and we need to hear that today. Because what we find in this next discourse as Jesus is talking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives is he refers to the certainty of his return. I want you to recognize that this morning. That somewhere throughout this passage, His attention goes from the destruction of Jerusalem to his ultimate return to finish this world as he deems appropriate. He's coming back. And here's what he says. I want you to go down to chapter 13, verse 24. I want you to look at what he says. This is right in the middle of this discourse. The question was, when is the temple going to fall? But listen to where the conversation ended up in verse 24. So we're going to start in the middle. We'll work back around. He says, but in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Well, that's not talking about the destruction of the temple there, is it? He's talking specifically. The day is coming when the King of glory is going to return. When the Son of Man, he calls it. And he had referred to himself in those terms many, many times. So his disciples knew exactly what he was talking about. Hey, Jesus is going to leave us. He's told us that. But now he's telling us something so much more exciting, that one day he will return. You remember John chapter 14? John chapter 14, verse 1 and following. This is another discussion that he had with disciples on the week of his crucifixion. And he had told his disciples these things were going to happen, and they were discouraged about it. And John records these words. He said, Jesus spoke to his disciples and said, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that? And I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. That's a great promise. And he had made that promise to his disciples. He didn't say, I was going to stay here forever, but he said, I'm going to leave, and one day I will come again to receive you unto myself. And now in this passage, he's talking about things like the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give us light. Well, what in the world is all of that? Well, let me invite you to come to our Revelation study tonight at 5:30. You'll find out. Seriously, we talked about this exact thing last week, didn't we? Y'all remember that? Let's go back to Revelation chapter 8, which is where we were just a week or so ago in Revelation chapter 8. He's referring to the different plagues that are the different plagues of wrath, the trumpet blast of wrath that are going to come during the tribulation period. And I'll explain that in just a second. And it says in verse 12, the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Jesus said, remember, when these things start happening, you're going to know that you're very, very close. Look this way for a second. I'm going to explain something to you. We like to talk about the second coming of Jesus Christ, and we're talking about that this morning. But just so we'll be clear as to what we're exactly talking about, I'm going to give you a quick synopsis, a quick summary of what that means to the believer. See, I think that the second coming of Jesus Christ for the believer, for the church, the true church, is two-part. I want you to follow me. I believe that a day is coming when Jesus is going to return in the clouds to call his church home. We're going to see a passage in just a moment out of 1 Thessalonians. I refer to that as the rapture of the church. Okay? So as far as we're concerned, that's pretty much the second coming of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's when we get engaged in what is happening at the end times. I believe the Bible teaches that rapture of the church is going to be followed by 7 years of tribulation. And we just read about that. A lot of things are going to happen on planet Earth. The tribulation, the wrath of God being poured out on the sinful, broken world. The church having been raptured out. At the end of that tribulation time, after the end of that 7 years, then the Bible teaches a literal, physical, bodily return of Jesus Christ to planet Earth, where he will establish a millennial reign here on earth. Okay? Now, that's the revelation. That's what we're going to be talking about in end times. You'll come back tonight at 5:30 and you'll get some more information like that. But for this morning, this is very important. When we talk about the second coming of Jesus Christ, I'm lumping all of that into one piece. Is that fair? Look this way if you understand what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the whole thing is going to happen one of these days, and this is what Jesus is teaching. So we know that this is one piece for this morning. I'm not going to try to split that up today. But for this morning, we're talking about, for the church, the rapture. For the rest of the world, the return at the end of the tribulation period. But we're going to see those 7 years or so as one piece and call them the second coming or the return of Christ. And he says, know that it is going to happen. There's a certainty there, and we need to understand that certainty. But their question was, Lord, when are these things going to take place? They were talking about the temple. So Jesus came back and said, okay, let me help you understand that though you do not know specifically when, there are some signs. There are some conditions that must be met. Let's go to verse 7 and 8. He says, and when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is not yet. Note that. Things are going to get rough on planet Earth. But the end is not yet. He goes on. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. All right. Now he's given us some conditions here. He says there's going to be wars, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be famines. In 70 A.D., when Rome overtook Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, there were many who stood up and said, hey, this must be the end. It's got to be the end. Because there's never been a war like this one. There's never been a destruction like this one. There was great pain and great agony among the people of God. But the disciples remembered this conversation on the Mount of Olives and said, no, not yet. This isn't it. This isn't it. Jesus told us these things are going to happen. And when they do, they're but the beginning of birth pains. Now, let's just be honest. I have never had a birth pain in my life. I got nothing here. You know where I'm going with this? I got nothing. I tell people I fathered 3 sons, was right there when they were all born. I never felt a thing. Yeah. But I think I'm right when I say this. I think this is a perfect illustration when talking about the conditions of his return, birth pains. Because here's what I do believe or assume to be true about birth pains. Okay, ladies, I'm honest. I'm out of my lane here. I got that, so you can correct me if you need to. But here's what I think is right. I think birth pains start rather mild and far apart. Okay, so I see some ladies shaking their head. I'm feeling better. Right? And as you get closer to the birth, the pains intensify and get closer together. Right? Until the baby is born. So Jesus said, when you begin to see wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes, these are going to be like labor pains, which mean that at first they're going to be rather mild and spread apart. But as we get closer to the end, is the world going to get better? Not according to Jesus. It's going to get worse. and worse and worse. And these things are going to grow in intensity and in frequency and more and more and more until, boom, he returns. Okay, so the problem is, it's like when it comes to understanding his message about birth pains, it's like it's our first child. Okay, and again, I'm way out of my lane here. But I would think, ladies, and help me if I'm wrong, I would think that it's different the first time. Because there's so much unknown. Okay? I would think that any and every birth pain would be the real one. This is horrible. But, you would learn, 12, 14 hours later, that one wasn't it. It gets worse. And I think that's what we're dealing with today. And this is one of the reasons why I believe the church has lost its intensity in watching for the return of Christ. Here's why. I think that every time we experience a birth pain on planet Earth that Jesus described, we have those who tell us this is the one. Right? Yeah. This is it. It's got to happen now. And then when it doesn't happen, we wait for the next time. And then we have more calamity on earth, and now this must be it. And what we've ended up with, I believe, is the church is like the people in the village with the boy who cried wolf. You remember that story? And we've heard it so many times, it doesn't really mean anything to us anymore. It's like, yeah, I've heard that story. I've heard that sermon many times. And we've lost our intensity. We've lost our expectation. So you might say, well, Pastor, why does that matter? Here's why it matters. I think the greatest deterrent to discipleship in the modern church today is the fact that we've lost our expectation for the return of Jesus Christ. I honestly believe that. We live as though it probably won't happen anytime soon. Let's just do a little test. Let me ask you this question. What if you knew for a fact that this whole thing that I just described, this return of Christ, the rapture of the church, and the beginning of the tribulation period was going to start before midnight tonight? You knew that for a fact. Do you think it would change at all how you lived your life today? With me. What if you knew for a fact that the return of Christ was going to happen before the end of this year? Would it change anything at all? I think it would. What if you knew for a fact that you were going to be called home before the end of your lifetime and you were going to see Him face to face? Would it change anything about how you live your life? I think it would. I truly do. I think it would for all of us. I think we would live with a greater intensity, a greater intentionality, a greater desire to follow Him, a greater desire to please Him, a greater desire to tell others about Him, a greater desire to learn of Him and His Word, if we knew. You see, when He said to Peter, James, and John, I'm going to return, they believed it and they expected it. And one day, 40 days or so after His resurrection, they had been walking with Him and He began to ascend into heaven, into the clouds. And they watched Him as He went completely out of sight. Just imagine that for a moment. And the next thing they saw was an angel who said, why are you gazing up into the heavens like this? This same Jesus that you will see ascending will in like manner descend. And it was though those guys looked around and said, fellas, we got to get started. Let's go. And they went out and set the world on fire for the gospel. They were not to be stopped. Why? Because they believed that he was coming any moment, and they lived the life with that kind of expectation. And we've lost the expectation of his coming. He continued in this discourse to talk to them about the purpose of his coming. He wanted them to be sure of why he was coming back. Let's go back to verse 27. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heaven. He's coming for his own. I want you to know that he's coming for his own. When you read and you study the book of Revelation, we see Jesus at the right hand of the Father, and the commands come from the throne, and Jesus is executing those commands as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But there's one thing that is promised throughout the book of Revelation, and that is this: through all of the tribulation, through all of the wrath, through all of the destruction, the children of God will be protected by the mighty hand of God. All the way through it says it over and over and over. But my children, but my little ones, he says over and over. He will take care of his own. And that's the purpose of his return. You see, the wrath of God is going to be poured out on this earth because of its sinfulness, because of its brokenness. And I believe it is bad now, and I think it's going to continue to get worse until that day. And God is going to be very justified in pouring out his wrath on this earth. But the children of God are going to be protected, because it was as though Jesus was looking at his friends and he was saying, don't you guys worry about it, because I got your back. I got your back. I won't leave you. I won't forsake you. I'm coming for my own. We go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I told you about this passage a few moments ago. Let's just go there and look at it right quick. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. And that's a colloquialism of the first century for those who have passed away, those who are asleep, those who have died. That you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. You see, here's their crisis. They believed that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. They expected it. They were looking for it, and then all of a sudden it didn't happen, and people in their congregation, good people, godly people, were passing away. And the question was, well, what happens to them? They've missed it. They didn't live long enough. So Paul writes back and says, I don't want you to worry about those people. Listen what happens to them. For this we declare, verse 15, by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. That's why he's coming. And that's why he's coming. Then we fast forward over to Revelation chapter 19. At the end of this tribulation period, 7 years before, the church had been raptured out. And then we see this. I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and the one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. See, here's what the Bible teaches, is that he calls his righteous out. He calls his church out. And when He returns, He's coming not to make peace, but to make war on all that is evil and all that is sinful and all that is broken on this earth. That's what it says. That's the purpose of His return. And what should be our response? Let's finish with this. Look at verse 32. And following. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on your guard. Keep awake. For you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, and when he leaves his home, he puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. There's our response. I hope you see a theme happening here. In verse 5, He said, see to it that no one leads you astray. Be on your guard in verse 9, but be on your guard in verse 23. Again, be on your guard in verse 33. Keep awake in verse 33. Therefore, stay awake, verse 35. Stay awake in verse 37. Over and over again, He's talking to these disciples and He says, guys, I want you to know, you better stay ready. You've got to stay ready. Live every day on the ready for the return of Jesus Christ. Are you ready? Are you living on the ready? I introduced a hypothetical what if earlier. Let me return to there before we close. What if it were today? Are you ready? Are you ready? Do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Are you one of the ones that are going to be protected? Are you sure of that? Have you surrendered your life to His Lordship? Have you confessed your sin before God? Said, Lord, I'm lost and I need salvation and I need redemption and I need forgiveness and I claim all that you bring. Are you ready? Are you living with an urgency? Are you a disciple of Jesus Christ? Are you following hard after Him? Are you learning all that you can learn? Are you sharing all that you can share? What if it were today? It's day 3. It's Tuesday. Jesus is on His way to the cross. And He sits down on a hillside with His disciples. And He says, guys, I'm going to leave, but I'm coming again. And when I come again, it's going to be way different. You need to be ready.
Thank you for visiting this message from Old Fort Baptist Church. Here at Old Fort, we value biblical truth, missional living, and vital connections. To learn more about who we are and what we do, please visit us online at oldfortbaptist.org. To help support the ongoing ministry of the church, you can give at oldfortbaptist.org/give. Thank you, and God bless.